Jim Irsay owned the Indianapolis Colts. His father was the controversial Robert Irsay, who owned the Baltimore Colts, who moved the franchise in the middle of the night to Indianapolis. Jim Irsay passed away, multiple health complications, only age 65. Somebody asked me yesterday, or actually last night, give me a word to describe your view of Jim Irsay. And I interviewed him maybe twice, maybe three times over the course of when I was the voice of the Chargers and the Seahawks. He was a Rubik's Cube personality. He was just all over the place. He was dynamic. He was diverse. He lived a lavish life. He had enormous problems with addictions. And I think the addictions, alcohol, painkillers, because of injuries, back problems, neck problems, really led to his early death. But as controversial as he was as an individual, what he did with civic gestures in Indianapolis is beyond description. His contributions to charities in the 317 area code in Indianapolis and that county's just absolutely spectacular. And the other piece of the equation, I'll give you an example. Tony Dungy talked about this today. Tony Dungy, great man of faith, coach of the Colts, obviously Tampa Bay, Super Bowl. Now he's on network TV. His dad was in the final years of his life. His dad was in a wheelchair. His dad used to come, I think, from Chicago to Indianapolis for Colts home games. And Jim Irsay met him. And Jim said, does your dad get to go to any of your road games? And Tony said, no, he really can't. Can't make the travel connections by himself. And Jim Irsay said, you set up a system where he gets to Indianapolis, I will put your dad on my private charter and we'll go to all these road games. How cool a gesture is that? So that's who this guy was. I listened to an interview that he did a couple of years ago. And again, he was diverse. I said Rubik's Cube. He was all over the place. He had this interview, and I can't recall who he talked to. It was on a podcast. But he talked about life in the NFL, inheriting the Colts from his father, the ugliness of Robert Irsay, who was a raging alcoholic, who wrecked the Baltimore Colts franchise and then moved it in the middle of the night to Indianapolis, and what Jim had to do to restore the image of Colts football. He talked about that, but he also talked about topics like Jim Morrison and the Doors, because Jim Irsay was a big rock and roll music guy, cool. rock and roll collector of guitars and everything. Right on. Phenomenal museum that he built. He was an avid reader. He talked about Jack Kerouac, the beatnik writer back from the 50s and 60s. He talked about reading Gandhi. I mean, he was so different. And the one thing that he never gets enough credit for, he was the stand-up guy at league meetings. Most of these owners are in the shadows and they don't want to cause any ruckus or anything. When they needed to solve the problems with the union, Jim Irsay stood up, and he's the one that helped create the structure of the salary cap. And the salary cap in the NFL has made the league just phenomenally competitive. And when everybody else shut up, he's the one that stood up at a league meeting and pointed at Daniel Snyder, then owner Washington Redskins Commanders, and made the insinuation, what you're doing to this league publicly can no longer be tolerated. He led the rush to get Daniel Snyder evicted as the owner of the Washington franchise. Snyder was the one who was involved with the toxic workplace thing and got fined $10 million. And Snyder had threatened Roger Goodell and other owners like Jerry Jones. I have a lot of dirt on you and I will spill all this out. And Jim Irsay stood up and said, you're going to tell the country about me? They already know about me. Yeah. You don't stand for anything good about the Shield. We should get you out. And that led to a vote in which they evicted Daniel Snyder as owner of the Washington Redskins. And Snyder left the country and moved to London, England in disgrace. So Irsay was many things to many, many people. It's kind of sad in Indy because he really was beloved despite all of his demons. Really unique guy. Like I said, Rubik's Cube of personality.
It's funny. We talked about Jim Irsay before, bad guy. Now we're talking about Jim Irsay, good guy. But I'm curious now about the history of the salary cap in the NFL. Because if he came up with the idea and kind of cooked up the algorithm for it, when did that go into effect? And what was life in the NFL like before the salary cap? Was it the wild, wild west, or were there luxury tax penalties like in Major League Baseball? What was it like?
No, at that point in time, before all this happened, going back into there was no free agency. That's why there were so many work stoppages in the 80s into the 90s in the NFL. There was no free agency, and players went out on strike. A union was led by Howard Slusher, who was just a violent agent, and they sued and they struck. And they came to an agreement as to how free agency would work when there had never been any free agency. You think George Halas is going to agree to free agency? No. So they worked that, and then as part of that, they worked how the structure of salaries would go. Then it became gross revenue sharing rather than Paul Brown, Mike Brown putting all the money in their pocket in Cincinnati. Now they had to start playing, and it was all based on gross revenue coming in. So there were increments of things that made it win-win for both sides, and Jim Irsay was part of the ground floor of that. Another owner was Art Modell, who was disgraced in Cleveland when he moved the Browns to Baltimore. But Art Modell was responsible for Monday Night Football. He was responsible for how the TV contracts were laid out. And now what's the biggest thing the NFL has? Television.
Right, yeah.
So, I mean, there are people who have had great influential impact on the structure of the game, the economics of the game, not just the X's and O's of the game, but the business aspect of the game. But there was none of that until the mid-1990s, and they had to have some really bitter work stoppages before they got to that point in time. It's just like baseball. Baseball reserve clause, baseball free agency, baseball strikes, World Series cancellations, etc.
Can you imagine if, we go back in time, like in the 80s and 90s, and the New York Giants and New York Jets had their own packages, their own cable networks? I mean, it was a different world back then.
Sure. Well, Jerry Jones has barked about that in more recent times, that America's team, our value in this league is much greater than some small market like the Arizona Cardinals that don't freaking win and have a small amount of revenue, or Cincinnati's nickel and dime operation where Mike Brown's running like Paul Brown put the money in his pocket. There is a semblance to some of the things that Jerry Jones says are probably true. But for the greater good of everybody, this business model they have in a league, holy cow.
Jerry Jones is doing okay for himself.
Oh, no doubt about that.
That guy's making money all over the place. When we were in Dallas over the weekend, and his practice facility out in Frisco.
Yes.
Apparently, that he bought that land, and the agreement that he had with the city of Frisco, he pays no property tax at all.
Mm-hmm.
And in order to gain that advantage, he had to allow like high school football games and graduation ceremonies in that practice facility in Frisco. So it's like Jones he's good at using his name and his brand, making cash all over the place, but I'm not pulling out the miniature violin for that guy, so everyone's doing pretty well in the NFL.
They go. Other topics aside from the passing of Jim Irsay, and they're really mourning in Indianapolis because he meant a lot to that community in terms of civic gestures and philanthropy. In Jacksonville, the Jaguars, John. They got the Heisman Trophy winner, Travis Hunter. Well, he has spent the first week and a half at their OTA minicamps working strictly on the offensive side of the football. And it has been a real struggle. And I've seen some of the videos. The coaches are saying he's raw, he's really green, he's very undisciplined. We're talking about him running pass routes. And I've seen the video of him running wrong routes. His mechanics are screwed up, him stumbling coming out of breaks, him with bad feet. And it kind of spins back to what one of those NFL player personnel guys told me before the draft when we talked about the guys from Colorado, that they ran a junk offense, that it was not disciplined. It was a lot of freelance, and it was just athletes running deep and catching a ball. So Travis Hunter's going through quite a bumpy learning curve. And, he's wiry, but he's not big and strong. I saw one video where the coaches have these big pads and the wide receiver comes off the line of scrimmage and they pop him like a cornerback would. And Travis Hunter's just getting knocked on his ass and getting knocked off his route all the time. So there's a learning curve here, and they got between now and obviously the preseason games for him to ramp it up and actually learn about the disciplines and the science of running the right routes, etc., and the moves. You're just not going to get by because you can fast fly. That doesn't work in the NFL. So that's an interesting story there in Jacksonville. Cleveland. Need to explain this one to me. I mean, Brown's got all the quarterbacks in the world wearing orange helmets. Brown's got 5 guys in the quarterback room. None of them have proven they can be starters any longer. Anyhow, Deshaun Watson has been given the clearance by his doctors to start throwing. And, of course, he's coming off 2 torn Achilles tendon surgeries. Not going to play at all this year. I just asked the question. He's in the building. He's attending quarterback meetings and having input. And he's on the sidelines throwing passes all the time while the other 4 quarterbacks are on the. Why are we doing this from a distraction standpoint? It makes no sense at all to me. And then there's Dallas. New coach Brian Schottenheimer. He's talking about the newly acquired wide receiver George Pickens, who came from Pittsburgh. You know, the George Pickens who was told, we don't want you anymore, was traded to the Cowboys for a 3rd and 5th round draft pick. So Brian Schottenheimer has access to George Pickens for 3 workouts. 3. The first 3 workouts of the OTAs. And the first thing out of Brian Schottenheimer's mouth is, I am really impressed with the maturity level of George Pickens. To which I say, you're kidding me. Because I know everything about what Pickens did in Pittsburgh and all the junk and how Mike Tomlin reacted and what Art Rooney had to say. And 3 practices in, Schottenheimer is praising the maturity level of George Pickens after we saw 3 years of controversy with this guy in Pittsburgh, stomping and snorting and just screwing up and being angry and unhappy and giving up on plays, etc. So, John, go ahead. We already talked about Jim Irsay. We want to talk about the Jaguars and Travis Hunter and his Heisman, the quarterbacks, none of whom can start yet in Cleveland, and George Pickens. Amazing.
Excuse me. Yeah, George Pickens is kind of an unusual personality, right?
Diva.
A diva. You know, that's a lot of these receivers are a diva. I think Travis Hunter, by the way, he's a diva, but a different kind of a diva. Have you noticed that? So far, but I saw this story where he was on an airplane and there was an old lady sitting next to him on a commercial flight, and they had a wonderful conversation. The lady had no idea who he was. And at the very end of the flight, everyone's deplaning, and they were asking Travis Hunter for his autograph. And the old lady said, "Oh, are you someone famous?" And he goes, "Oh, I just signed with the Jacksonville Jaguars." So, and she was complimenting how much of a gentleman he is. And he's just an interesting kind of outgoing guy. How big is he? I mean, my perception is he's not super tall. Is he like Tyreek Hill size?
No, he's taller. I want to say 6'1" maybe. But if he's 190, that's with a cement block in his pocket. They're going to have to build his upper body. He's wiry, no doubt about it. And in college, he's fast. But that's college. That's not the NFL. And I saw the pass routes he was running. I said, holy cow, this is a real project here.
Well, I'm sure a lot of college receivers are like that. They just out-athlete the other cornerbacks. But when you're a receiver in the NFL, I mean, talk me through the level of precision. Is it like, 3 yards and then go 45-degree angle for another 6 steps? And then, I mean, is it really? And I'm sure the timing of it is all in sync with the quarterback reads and the way the quarterback clicks.
You just described it all. Double moves and all that.
Mm-hmm.
Strides, plant, explode, etc. That's all a piece of the equation. And I mean, if you can't get off the line of scrimmage, you're getting blown up at the line of scrimmage. And I'll tell you, these cornerbacks in the league, they'll do everything, including strangle you as you try to get off the line of scrimmage, you're on your route. So he's got a lot of work to do. And his footing was screwy. I mean, I was amazed. I said, somebody that's had 2 tremendous years at Colorado, and he did put up great numbers, but he's not refined from a style discipline standpoint.
Well, who is? I mean, who is refined when they come out, as a rookie? And I'm sure the veterans in camp are like saying, all right, rookie, you're playing with the big boys now. And they were probably giving him the business, a little bit of a kind of a hazing to a degree.
A lot of work to be done there. I mean, I'm kind of spoiled. I sat here and I watched Puka Nacua with the Rams. He came out of BYU, and holy cow. I mean, he was refined.
He was an exception
in terms of his routes and all that. Can you say Ladd McConkey, what we saw
Yeah.
year one
Yeah, he's all right.
from the
Yeah,
Chargers?
he's
Yeah.
good.
Travis Hunter, nowhere is close to the mechanics of what those guys have shown us.
Yeah, I mean, so I'm happy for Jacksonville. I want them to be relevant. I want Trevor Lawrence to like win. I thought he was a fun quarterback to follow when he was at Clemson. But as far as the other teams, Deshaun Watson, if they're inviting him into the quarterback room, to be the elder statesman, the man that can give his advice and wisdom, which seems kind of funny given his track record. But is he like persona non grata in Cleveland, or they really want his input?
Well, they're
I'm
stuck
confused.
with a contract. I mean, they can't release him. His cap hit's like $131 million.
Yeah, but I would think that if they don't like Deshaun Watson, said, "Hey man, we're tired of your act," they would just say, "Hey man, why don't you just go on vacation and rehab that thing? We've got enough quarterbacks here, and when you get healthy next year, we'll integrate you back in."
At this point, that has not happened yet.
Interesting.
I found it really weird that this guy's standing on the sidelines throwing passes.
Well, I mean, if you're Dylan Gabriel, you're looking over your shoulder.
Shedeur Sanders.
Yeah, and you got Sanders, and you got Kenny Pickett, and you got good old Joe Flacco there. I mean, 5 quarterbacks in that room. One of them has to get cut, right? I mean, well, besides Watson isn't going to play, but of those 4, at least one is going to be cut. Right?
I concur wholeheartedly. I mean, the rumor is that they're going to stay with Kenny Pickett, and Flacco may ask for his release, which would mean you'd have the 2 kids being your second and third quarterback. I don't know anybody that does that, but Cleveland's done a lot of unorthodox things with that ownership group. So this bears watching as we go to July and the opening of camp. Hey.